I'm Doug Elmendorf, the Dean of the Kennedy School. Welcome to the second Dean's discussion of the semester. We're doing 3 discussions this semester on different topics of particular pressing importance. The first discussion we had last month was about how the media can help to strengthen democracy. The third discussion that we'll do at the end of this month is about achieving a more peaceful world. Today, we're going to focus on the absolutely crucial question of how to restore health and economic growth in developing countries. And we are very lucky to have this discussion anchored by 4 of our amazing faculty members. Marcella Alsan is a professor of public policy, fairly recent arrival at the Kennedy School. Marcy is both an economist and a physician. Second faculty member here today is Jie Bai. Jie is an assistant professor of public policy. Her research focuses on economics of developing countries and emerging markets. Third faculty member here today is Ricardo Hausmann. Ricardo is the Rafik Hariri Professor of the Practice of International Political Economy. He is a very distinguished and globally recognized expert on development, leads at the Kennedy School, the Growth Lab at our Center for International Development. And the fourth faculty member with us today is Celestin Monga. Celestin is a visiting faculty member this year. He's an alumnus of the Kennedy School and has had also a very distinguished career in teaching and practice. He's had senior roles at the World Bank, at the African Development Bank, and other universities, and we're delighted to have him here with us for this year. And to moderate the discussion between you and these 4 faculty members is Sarah Wald, my chief of staff, also an adjunct lecturer at the Kennedy School and the law school. And so I will hand this over to Sarah with my thanks to all of my colleagues and all of you for joining today. Sarah, please.
Thank you, Dean. Welcome to everyone. And as usual, the format will be as follows: that we'll hear briefly from each of our 4 faculty panelists, and then we will open it up for questions and discussion from all of you. Our first panelist is Professor Alsan, and as you note, the title is about both the health and the economic recovery of developing nations. So they're very closely related in this current time, of course, and we'll be talking about that interrelation. But first, to set the broader health context is going to be Professor Alsan. So.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Doug and Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining. It's really an honor to be on a panel with such distinguished other faculty. So I thought I would start by just talking about the state of the pandemic in terms of deaths and cases. So to date, there's been 133 million total confirmed cases and about 600,000 confirmed cases a day worldwide, which is down from 740,000 cases seen a few months ago, but up from just a month and a half ago when we were at 360,000 confirmed cases a day. Global confirmed deaths, which typically trail cases, have begun to rise in the past 3 weeks to an average of about 10,000 deaths a day. So far to date, there has been almost 3 million confirmed COVID-19 deaths worldwide, with over 500,000 of those cases occurring in the United States. Obviously, the good news on the horizon has been the growth in daily vaccine doses administered, including our very own Dean, hopefully later today, with an average of 16 million doses administered per day, which is up from just 7 million doses about a month ago. But unfortunately, less than 5% of the world's population has actually received a vaccine, and less than 2% of the world's population has been fully vaccinated against COVID-19. And the major issue here, which will probably dovetail with some of the other discussions, has been supply constraints. That's been a major challenge for vaccination efforts. And current models, these are just models, can change, but predict that there will not be enough vaccines to cover the world's population until 2023 or 2024. Another serious issue, which I'm sure many have heard about, is the inequitable distribution of vaccines. So far, the majority of vaccines have been going to the minority of the population. Nearly 30% of all vaccines administered have been administered in the United States, even though the US is only 4.2% of the overall population. And troublingly, in the entire continent of Africa, has received or has administered approximately the same number of doses as either Chile or Israel or Italy, either one of those countries. Now, a really good resource for people that are interested in following this in real time is the Duke Global Health Innovation Center. They've been tracking all of these advanced purchase commitments, and they've been tracking the activities of COVAX, which is the public-private partnership led by UNICEF, Gavi, and the WHO, as well as CEPI. They have, COVAX is trying to, at first it was trying to spread risk such that if one of these vaccine candidates was successful, then the technology could be shared more broadly. Obviously, we've had several successes at this point, and so now they're really working on this second angle, which is equitable distribution. And they've confirmed 1.12 billion dose purchases, which is far short of the 2 billion that they had hoped to be able to purchase and also distribute. Despite recent commitments, COVAX is funded by partners, including developed countries, but those commitments have fallen short. In fact, COVAX is about $22 billion short of its needed funding. Now, I'll just say a few more things, and then I want to turn it over to other faculty members. So talking specifically about developing countries and some of the health challenges, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, it was felt that because the age distribution of developing countries skewed towards the younger end of the spectrum, there would be less of a health impact. And that did seem to play out for the first months of the pandemic, but now we're seeing about half of total deaths are now occurring in the developing world, which is much greater than it was at the beginning of the pandemic. And far, far greater, or just as great potentially as these direct effects of COVID-19 is the indirect health effects on other problems that these countries were dealing with HIV/AIDS, with TB, with malaria. So lockdown and some of the NPIs, these non-pharmaceutical interventions have meant that in about 28 countries, 60 polio vaccination campaigns in 28 countries were suspended due to the pandemic. So there's just been a global suspension of a lot of general activities that are being done both on vaccines and monitoring. And partly as a result of these challenges, the IHME, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, has forecast that there will be a setback, a quarter of a century setback in the control of HIV, TB, malaria, and NTD prevalence due to the pandemic. So first has been COVID-19 deaths itself. Second has been other infectious diseases and other diseases. Third has been the reallocation of resources that are generally, the budgets of low-income countries are already strained. On average, per capita expenditures in developing countries on health are $41 a year. That's compared to $5,000 a year in high-income countries, and those budgets are already extremely stressed. And then, of course, there's the economic fallout, which again, I think other people will speak to, but there's just projections of increasing malnutrition. The FAO projects that 83 to 132 million people will fall into malnutrition due to the pandemic. So I know one of the last things I was supposed to comment on is some countries have done better than others. And I think they have they have a secret sauce of they've had prior pandemics or public health challenges in the past that they've recently dealt with. I'll just say, Vietnam has been doing phenomenal. Thailand has been doing phenomenal for people that study the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Maybe that's not so surprising. Thailand was also both of these countries had coordinated government responses. You might have seen their jingles on TikTok. Their president was getting involved. Thailand did an amazing job with HIV/AIDS and condom use. They both were early movers on masks. Liberia actually has been doing very well after its Ebola pandemic. And then there are countries that are not doing well, and it's generally a mix of just really poor governance and lack of resources together that is occurring. And so my final thought is just with respect to what we can do. I think, the false dichotomy of health versus the economy, I think that has really been laid bare. And I think in order, actually the MGH, the Massachusetts General Hospital, put together a really nice call on the Biden administration about what physicians and researchers can do. And they wrote, and I'll just quote here, delivering vaccines only to wealthy countries is like trying to extinguish a house fire by pouring water in only one room. And so I think really this notion that we need to be very aware of what's going on in developing countries and try and help the situation there, not just because of the moral and ethical obligation, but also because of the different variants that can emerge. I think that's a really strong case to be made in the case of COVID-19.
Thank you, Professor Alsan. We're now going to hear from Professor Hausmann, who's going to segue into some of the policy interventions that can happen and this bridge between the health situation that you've talked about and some of the economic situation. Professor Hausmann.
Well, thank you. It's a great opportunity to be here. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Doug, for putting this together. And a fantastic set of colleagues in the panel. First, I would like to say that, Zhou Enlai was famous for having said that it's too soon to judge the French Revolution. I think it's very hard to judge a pandemic in the middle of the pandemic when you don't know what's coming next. And, the Growth Lab has been working on Jordan, has been working on Namibia. These countries did spectacularly well in 2020. They're in much serious trouble in 2021. So if you had asked, in November of last year, what's the secret of Jordan or what's the secret of Namibia, you would have been wrong, because essentially, the more disconnected a country is, the harder it is for it to start to get infected. But then once you start having community spread, then the story is different. So in most of the countries we're working on, people thought 2021 was the post-COVID. 2021 is not post-COVID. 2021 is COVID. Even for the ones that have been most successful at the vaccination, like say Chile. Chile has had the highest rate of per capita vaccinations per day. They've had to reimpose a severe lockdown because still, at the rates of 20–30% vaccination, it's not enough to stop the virus from spreading. You have to get much higher, and in the meantime, you pay the costs of having to shut down the economy. So I think that some countries that were perceived as successful are in the process of running out of luck. So 2021 is going to be a very, very challenging year. Unfortunately, if you look at, say, the World Economic Outlook projections for 2021 that were done in October of last year, countries were supposedly planning that after the stimulus and after the fiscal support to the economy in 2020, they were going to start cutting back in 2021. For example, Latin American countries on average were expecting to cut their deficits by 3 percentage points of GDP in 2021. I don't think that's going to happen. But for many countries, the issue is that they don't know if there's a potential fiscal financial crisis pending if they try to continue borrowing. They borrowed a lot in 2020 and markets were supportive, but they fear that the moment markets understand that they really need to borrow, markets may say, well, if you need us, maybe we don't need. And that's concerning because, as you've seen in the first quarter of this year, interest rates in the US are back up. The US is going to be an important borrower. There's fears that they may be crowded out in international financial markets. So I think the international community needs to focus on making sure that these countries have enough access to international finance. I mean, there's been some positive moves from the Biden administration. Janet Yellen has asked the G20 to make an issuance of SDR, so it's sort of like printing money at the global level, some $650 billion of it. I think that's potentially very useful. I think the countries are going to need much more official lending. We're seeing countries, say in Ethiopia, which are having to cut back on fiscal spending. Namibia cutting back on fiscal spending, and so on. I think two issues I wanted to raise that I think are important policy issues to think about. The first one is what I see as an emerging equity shortage, that many companies have gone under. Unemployment rates in Colombia and Peru are astronomically high. The loss of jobs has been just beyond belief, and many companies have gone under, and the ones that have survived have borrowed, have incurred losses, so they are short of equity. And if you're short of equity, it means that you look to a bank as over leveraged, and the best thing that could happen is for an equity injection for many of these companies. And I think that there's an enormous intellectual payoff to figure out ways in which the financial systems can inject not more debt, because these companies are already over indebted, but more equity, more patrimony into these firms. And how to do it, how can this be done through the market? Because if it's going to be done through the government, it's going to be too limited, it's going to be too small. We need to find a market solution for that, and we're thinking about it. The other thing that I think is a potential opportunity is that what COVID taught us is that many things that used to be done in the office can be done from home. And so there's been a lot of telework. But what people have paid less attention to is the fact that anything that can be done from home can be done from abroad. And that means that a lot of the tasks that need to be done in the global economy can be done from people with an internet connection, no matter where they are. And we're starting this. This is potentially a huge market, and it's potentially a huge opportunity for developing countries. It will have implications in rich countries in terms of that a lot of the tasks that are currently done locally might become part of international competition for doing these tasks. But we see a big uptake in electronic platforms such as Upwork and I forget the other, WeWork, or where tasks are being contracted that way, and I think that there's a big market that will be developed in the coming years for people in developing countries to be performing tasks remotely, and global value chains are going to be significantly restructured. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor Hausmann. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Monga, who's going to focus regionally on Africa and South Asia in particular, and continue giving us some more of the context of the economic situation. Professor Monga.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. I feel blessed to be part of this conversation with colleagues, and I'll make 4 points. And I'll probably start with some of the things that Professor Hausmann just talked about. First, what have we learned from the pandemic? I think he correctly points out that we need to be cautious, because it's certainly too soon to draw any definitive conclusion. But there are some preliminary things that we've seen. One good thing is, in my opinion, the fact that economists, especially macroeconomists, people in the ministries of finance all over the world, now they understand that health is a macroeconomic issue. If you had told this to a minister of finance only a year or two ago, they might not have understood the direct link between the fact that you have workers being sick or the economy being shut down and people not being able to go to work, and the fiscal revenues, the fiscal deficit, and the debt, and all the issues that come with these macro issues. So the link now between health and macro is very important. And I think that it's an intellectual benefit, quote unquote, from the pandemic. Second point is the fact that you look at the response to the pandemic globally. Rich countries have done most of what they could, both using the fiscal tool and also the monetary tool. In the United States, for instance, we have this staggering number that the US has spent 25% of its GDP in support of its economy just to fight this pandemic. It's incredible. It's remarkable. It's incredible. Well, unfortunately, very few countries in the world and very few regions in the world, especially in developing countries, have that kind of fiscal space and fiscal tools and the monetary space to do something even remotely comparable. So we are in a situation where we are fearing that we may get into what is being called the K-shaped recovery, where everybody goes down and then rich countries go up, but developing countries keep going down. So that would be really terrible for the global economy, because everybody needs to contribute to global growth because it benefits everybody. If you are part of the world which is still struggling to recover and not contributing to global demand, that means fewer opportunities, fewer markets, fewer possibilities of creating employment for everybody, not just for the poor countries. So we should, I believe, do everything we can to fight this K-shaped recovery that I think is looming out there. And of course, there is this unequal distribution of vaccines that Professor Alsan talked about. And it has, she mentioned some of the epidemiological issues, because if you have this coronavirus that keeps mutating, well, it doesn't, I mean, it matters, but nobody will ever be completely safe, even with the vaccine, if the virus continues to spread in many other parts of the world. So this inequity in accessing not just the vaccine, but also the PPE, the protective equipment, and the therapeutics, that's something that should be on the global agenda because it has to benefit everyone. A third point I would like to make is, of course, that we need to start thinking seriously about beyond the pandemic, what we've learned and what needs to be done differently. I think that Professor Hausmann kind of already laid out some of the fundamentals that everybody needs to think about. I would suggest that in the same vein, that even intellectually, we need to rethink a lot of knowledge that we previously had. And just in our area, my area, growth and macroeconomics, how do we make sure that the next pandemics or the next terrible bad thing, negative shock that will occur at some point in another, doesn't hit developing countries with the same severity? How do we intellectually prepare them? Can we keep doing business as usual in terms of our thinking, the dominant framework of thinking about growth, about inclusion, about sustainability, even about debt? There's a lot of talk about sovereign debt, public debt, especially in places like Africa. Well, how do we think seriously about that when these countries are confronted with so many issues? Okay? Are the frameworks that we are currently using to analyze debt sustainability the right ones? I have serious questions about the IMF World Bank debt sustainability framework. I think they are doing their best, but I think that there are some crucial elements which are missing in the understanding of the determinant of debt. The demography factor, for instance, you're talking about, at least in the continent of Africa, very high population growth rate. Well, that needs to be factored in because that means a big demand on public services. So you cannot just show up with a very static ratio to determine debt sustainability analysis when you have such huge demand for public services. There are issues which are not very often discussed, like security. A large number of countries in the world today are permanently confronted to serious security issues. In Africa, 18 countries out of 54 are constantly confronted with security issues. And some of them, at least one of them that I know well, is devoting, guess this, 52% of its annual budget to security. I mean, this is unbelievable. So if you do that, of course, you won't be prepared for any health crisis. You won't be prepared to deliver on high quality education. I'm raising this because in the conversation about some of the macro issues like growth or debt, you never hear that. But these key elements have to be brought into our thinking. And I don't want to keep the floor too long. I guess there will be question and answer, but let me just say perhaps one last thing, which has to do with the financing of development, both in South Asia and in Africa, because given the magnitude of the issues, well, I'm not sure that the current tools will be enough. Professor Hausmann mentioned, and I fully support that, the notion that the IMF could issue what is called SDR, the special drawing rights, which is basically a global financial assets which provides allocations to all countries in the world and disproportionately to rich countries. But we can imagine situations where rich countries actually let developing countries use most of their SDR allocations, and that would help provide financing. But that might not be enough. I think we need to seriously engage in new thinking about innovating financing tools and instruments for development in South Asia and in Africa, and blending financing from the private sector and from the government and being more creative. And there are avenues which we can discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are now going to hear from Professor Bai, who's going to shift our focus a little bit into some of the private sector recovery and what that looks like in developing nations. Professor Bai.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much for including me in this very distinguished panel to discuss this very important topic. I think in light of the big picture and the broad insights put forth by Marcy, Ricardo, and Celestin, I would talk about something that I've had the chance to work on more recently, which is the impact of the pandemic on micro, small, and medium enterprises, what we call the MSMEs in developing countries. And in particular, think about the promises and the challenges that e-commerce or digital platforms that have brought to developing country firms in the recovery process. So I think by now it's very clear that the pandemic has been most damaging for small businesses all around the world, in particular in developing countries, given their low liquidity cash. So many firms have shut down permanently, and many are still struggling to make profits as the economies reopen. At the beginning of the pandemic, governments, I think many governments have reacted very quickly to the pandemic and introduced various relief packages, short-term fiscal measures to help these small businesses to survive. However, I think while the short-term goal is to survive, the long-term goal, as many of our discussants already mentioned, is really to think about creative solutions, thinking about ways going forward. And these important questions, how to create businesses or maintain businesses that are resilient and adaptive to this changing post-pandemic or during pandemic environment. Another thing, so it's also becoming increasingly clear, as Ricardo mentioned, that the crisis has permanently shaped many things for the future. Things that can be done from work now can be done from home, and can be done from home can be done across national borders. So against that backdrop, one thing that's definitely happening is this accelerated shift towards digital economy. Consumers switched from offline to online shopping, and now firms that can actually make that digital transformation more quickly will likely survive and thrive in the post-pandemic world. Some people are quite optimistic. They describe this as a form of creative destruction. Now you can imagine small businesses all around the world, in developing countries, in Ghana, in Cambodia, everybody can open a shop on digital platforms and thinking that they can tap into the global market. Essentially, it allows firms to extend market access beyond geographical boundaries. And at the same time, as consumers are shifting their purchases from offline to online. So that's all, all of the promises, and there are reasons to be optimistic. If we look at China's recovery from the pandemic, as Marcy mentioned, I think mass mobilization, they've learned a lot of lessons from the SARS pandemic earlier on. I think that definitely is an important part of the China's fight against the pandemic. But another important part of the story is these booming activities on the country's large digital platforms, e-commerce platforms. For example, take the food delivery sector as one example. Here I'm quoting some very exciting findings from one of our own students, this year's SIPA, written by second-year MPID students, looks at the adoption of online platforms by small restaurants in the country. And it finds that actually the adoption of digital, like third-party delivery digital platforms increased by 63 percentage points after the pandemic, and mostly concentrated among small and medium restaurants. So that definitely, it creates this potential for businesses to recover and to continue to grow, especially for small businesses. The key feature of digital economy and e-commerce is really the low entry cost compared to opening a firm in the offline environment. It has very low entry barrier and very low, relatively low, operation costs as well of maintaining an online store. So it lowers the entry barrier, allows firms to tap into the larger market. So now, surprisingly, given all these promises, there have been many initiatives around the world, especially after the pandemic, to foster the growth of e-commerce, and often with a specific policy target to onboard these MSMEs onto these platforms and hoping that they will grow. Now, that said, if we actually look at the data, unfortunately, not every firm is successful in that digital transformation. In fact, many firms are not. So if you look at the data, the sales on these, take any digital platform, if you look at the data, it's just like offline. It's very concentrated at the top. The market is dominated by a few superstars at the top who are making lots of sales to consumers. And at the same time, you have a huge long tail of small firms making, dormant firms who are there, but they're making close to zero sales, even though they've been brought onto the online platforms. So that tells us there are important additional growth hurdles that these firms need to overcome beyond initial onboarding. I think that calls for, this is like e-commerce, not something new. The good thing is that it has been growing pretty fast prior to the pandemic. So many countries have already had the infrastructure, building that internet infrastructure to, and now, it's just like we're going to make that process happening faster. But I think policymakers should really think of additional creative solutions to help firms beyond the initial onboarding. There are important demand side and supply side frictions in this online marketplace that need to be overcome. I know we're going to. I don't want to take too much time. If we in the discussion, I'm happy to share some of our recent work that tries to. We're collaborating with ADB that tries to help design these platforms and help firms to manage the future growth process on these digital platforms.
Thank you very much, Professor Bai. Now we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and just to remind everyone of the Kennedy School standards for questions, which is that they're on topic. Feel free to either direct it to a particular panelist or to all of them, that it's one at a time, and that it ends in a question mark. So if you would raise your hands digitally, that would be helpful, because we have too many people to see on one screen. Let's see. Let's see. The first question I have is from Paul Rosenboom. Paul?
Hi, thank you very much. A couple of the panelists mentioned about the digitalization of economies. And what language spheres is that happening in the most? Has anyone looked at, is this happening in Spanish? Is this happening in French or English or Mandarin? Where's the best opportunities for that you've seen?
I don't know, maybe Professor Bai, if you have, since you had just talked about that, and then if anybody else has additions.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Paul. I think people nowadays talk about cross-border digital platforms. Take, for example, e-commerce is one particular form of digital platforms. They're really thinking about global entrepreneurs, like cross-border sales. Because now, as Ricardo mentioned, now people travel, consumers, the demand is really wide, right? People travel abroad. So you don't have to just sell to domestic consumers now. But of course, there are a lot of challenges with cross-border e-commerce beyond just e-commerce. In China during last year, in April 2020, I think the president announced like a lot of policies to foster cross-border transactions. They opened 40 plus pilot cities to basically ease the export process. But that involves multilateral collaborations for that to happen. I think the rising tension between the two countries is not very conducive for that. Yeah.
Let me add two more remarks. Thanks, Jie, for your response, and thanks, Paul, for your question. The first is that the bulk of the world is composed of countries that internally speak many languages. There are two regions in the world where you have many countries that speak one language. And those two regions are Latin America and the Arab world. So in both of those places, you see platforms that once you chose the language, then you naturally have an catchment area that goes beyond your borders. And there's been a lot of competition on who's going to create the content for the internet in the Arab world. And we've worked on Jordan to see how they might get an anchor on that. And there's a lot of action happening in Latin America in e-commerce and other things in a Spanish platform, even, all the typical things, the equivalent of Uber, the equivalent of these other things. The second remark I would like to say is that we're early on in the process. This is an issue of technological diffusion. These MSMEs that Jie was speaking about, they may not know how to do these things. And what's missing is a market for people to sort of like help them transform. So I think that there's a case here to take a page from agricultural extension services and just create digital extension services. There's a program like that in Colombia that has been sponsored by the World Bank. It's been evaluated and seems to be very effective. But one of the ideas I'm working on and pushing is the idea that governments should create, we have these huge rates of unemployment of the youth that are leaving the educational system and spend 10 years before they get their first job in many countries, that maybe the youth can be trained to help companies, digitize, and that would be a way in which they can acquire marketable skills, and that it would have the benefit of improving in the operations of the firms that they would benefit, and they would be left with some skills that they could eventually, sell abroad through telework and so on. So that's just, I think that the digitization is something that could benefit from technological extension.
Great. Next question is from Priyanka.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for today's panel. It's been really enriching. My question is around some of the supply chain disruptions that have been caused globally by COVID. How do you see developing countries that rely on, one, exporting commodities, et cetera, or two, importing certain things to add value and then re-export it, come out of the pandemic? And then separately also, do you think that there's going to be a differential in growth between countries that are able to manufacture their own vaccines inside the country versus having to import them? Yeah, two questions. Thank you.
Someone want to start out with this? Ricardo?
Okay, I'll take it. So broadly speaking, goods have performed much better than services. And I think they will perform very well in these coming years because the global economy is going to accelerate. The IMF has just upgraded their growth projections. And I think the US economy is going to be humming. So if anything, the concerns in the US are whether it's too much, etc. So and goods in general have performed well. Trade in goods has recovered. Trade in services has not. And many countries rely on tourism and so on. And that sector has been very severely hit and is recovering much more slowly. So I would have more of my concerns on the disruption in services than in goods. Even the worst performer among the goods, the commodity side is oil, but that that's not a major source of concern. On your second question, I'm blanking. Just give me a word to remind me on the second question was
vaccine manufacturers, countries.
This is the biggest disappointment in my mind. It should be clear that production capacity of these vaccines has to be globalized. I mean, there's one issue on who has the intellectual property, but the intellectual property is not the issue. We can buy it from them. This is just the amount of compensation for these firms is irrelevant. What we should have done last year is to build up the production capacity in as many countries as possible with no issues of intellectual property. We should have dealt with the issues of intellectual property separately. It's just a money problem. It's not a principal problem. And I think that going forward, it's very likely that we will have to vaccinate people, yearly or something like that. So it's not a once and for all investment that needs to be amortized at once. I think that we will need to have that capacity. It is, as Marcy was saying, we won't have the capacity to vaccinate the world until 2024. That can't be. I mean, it's not rocket science. If you know how to do it in one place, you could do it in many places, right? We know production capacity in Brazil. We know production capacity in South Africa. It could be in Mexico. It could be in Colombia. It could be in many other places. And it will be needed in the future, and it will make the world safer in the future. So I think that was a missed opportunity last year for lack of, I would blame lack of U.S. leadership in this matter. I think that it's something that the world should get around.
Marcy, do you want to have a
sure. I'll just add to that because I know, part of my hat is obviously an economist. The other part is, I've worked in a pandemic. I've worked in Africa, and the difference between when millions of Africans died from HIV/AIDS prior to getting access to antiretroviral therapy. And South Africa and India have come to the WTO asking for protections if they manufacture, and the pharmaceutical companies have actually come out. There's, you can search up online the letter to the Biden administration asking them to not support the activities of India and South Africa. You can actually see just a map of which countries are supporting South Africa and India and which are not, and it's a north-south map. And so, what's really interesting is that the way that these vaccines are being produced, there's so many different ways to produce them. There's obviously the new mRNA technology, which is extremely exciting, but has these requirements of like actually really, really severe cold chains that are needed, and 2 doses are needed. And then there are the sort of older viral vector-based technologies. There's a new study going on in the University of Texas right now using egg-based production technologies, which seems really exciting as well. That's sort of an older way to produce vaccine, all kind of focused on the spike protein. But what a lot of countries are asking for, a lot of the global south is asking for is, yes, we want the vaccine, but we also want exactly what Priyanka you asked for. We want the ability to actually produce it within our borders, or not be prosecuted if we do pursue production. And for the very newest technologies, mRNA, what differentiates what a lot of people will say is, well, it's easier to make a drug than it is a vaccine. And that, I think there is a lot of challenges, particularly with the mRNA, a lot of supply chain issues. If you look at where all of these products are coming from, they're coming from all over the world. Moderna is importing from all over the globe some of the things that it needs. So that's going to be more challenging. But again, there are several different ways now to make vaccines, and I think what countries are asking for is what a waiver which was granted in the HIV/AIDS crisis.
Can I say something,
yes,
Sarah?
Of course.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Just picking up on what Marcella and Ricardo just said. The first question on the disruption of global value chain, I think it's a disaster, not just cause because of its economic implications are clear to everyone, but the biggest problem that I see there is that several rich countries from Canada to the US and France and others have picked up this motive to decide that they're going to produce themselves almost everything that was produced in developing countries before the pandemic. And this is not just masks or gloves and things like that. There's been some resurgence of nationalism in producing very basic stuff, which I think is uncalled for. Yes, when you're a rich country and then you're hit by the pandemic and you realize that all your gloves, all your masks comes from a particular country in the world and nothing can come from that because of the pandemic. I think what needs to be done is to diversify the suppliers. To say, okay, instead of relying on one single country for all our purchases of masks or gloves or whatever that is, we will have 2 or 3 of them. So that, but the idea that the notion that all the most basic 10 cents goods which were produced in developing countries need to be produced in advanced economies, to me doesn't make a lot of sense. It's costly. And it takes away the opportunity for these countries to get into the global market and to get out of poverty. I think it's something to be thought about. And then on the production of drugs, well, let me tell you one thing about Africa. 95% of drugs in Africa are imported. 95%. Less than 5% actually it's produced on the continent. This is obviously intolerable, unacceptable. And there are some rents somewhere, and there are some people profiting from this situation, but that cannot go on. And this issue needs to be brought on the table. Yes, part of it is intellectual property. As Professor Hausmann said, you can pay for that, but unfortunately, many countries simply don't have the money. to pay for it. So there should be discussions on intellectual property reform for poor countries, low-income countries, in terms of allowing them on the licensing, for instance, to produce locally some of the most basic drugs. Thank you.
Can I just add to that? It
Of
almost
course.
seems just, you know, we've had a huge shift among macroeconomists, of course, of which I have not one, on just how much, you know, how much the debt to GDP ratio, how much can a country really take on? And I think also, you know, this shift is happening. It's almost pandemic-induced shift, and it's enlightening. And a lot of people are coming together and starting to think outside the box. And I feel like that's also true when it comes to thinking about the health in developing countries, as Professor Monga was just saying, and how it's related to the economy, and thinking about how, you know, what is really the trade-offs between dynamic and static inefficiency. It feels like we need to rejigger our weights on that, particularly when we're talking about an infectious disease and a pandemic threat.
Thank you. Next question is Danielle.
Thank you. My question is actually to this point around financing the pandemic recovery, as well as all the other development goals that many countries have. I think Professor Monga had mentioned kind of the need for innovative financing. Professor Alsan speaking about debt just now. I wonder if the panel could speak a little bit more about where the funding needs to come from for the pandemic and beyond to reach development goals.
Someone want to jump in? Professor Monga?
Okay, yes, thank you, Sarah. Just quickly, on the debt issue, there's a lot of talk about Africa's debt, but that is a global problem. If you look at every single type of group of countries in the world, advanced, middle income, low income, it's a global problem. Now, of course, because low income countries have very low GDP, very low income, and you have to get export revenue to pay for your debt, external debt. The situation is more dicey. But if you look at globally, Africa's GDP compared to global GDP, it's like 2 or 3% of global GDP. But if you look at Africa's debt compared to global debt, Africa's debt is less than 1% of global debt. So right there, we have some preliminary evidence that Africa is not the center of global debt issues. Now, that doesn't mean there are some countries in Africa that are struggling seriously with debt and things need to be done. As we speak now, the IMF and the World Bank are holding what they call the spring meetings. So they are bringing all ministers of finance and central bank governors from all over the world. And this particular week, they are discussing what to do. And the outcome, which they will announce at the end of this week, it's no secret, they will probably provide a moratorium on Africa's debt. A moratorium simply means that, okay, we agree to postpone the payments that we expect from you. But at some point, you're going to pay everything, including interest rates on the delays. So it's just giving you a breather, but it doesn't really do anything about the debt. I think that they should go further. There's no political appetite for that, but they should go further and cancel upfront a lot of that debt, because there are good reasons, which we don't have time to get into, why there's this debt. And then on the financing, beyond the debt, I think that we need to bring the private sector into the development of, into the financing of development in creative ways. I can imagine some kind of tripartite deal with governments from some advanced economies, but also from countries where you have excess savings, like in the Middle East, in the Gulf countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, where there's a lot of sovereign wealth fund with a lot of billions of dollars sitting there looking for interesting investment opportunities. and then have international organizations like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and so on, coming in to provide guarantee and to support deals, and then bring the private sector from all of these places to provide huge financing. I think, and I shut up after this, this notion that if China goes to Africa, it's a problem, it's ludicrous. Africa needs anyone who can help finance investment needs an opportunity there. So the US should work with China, with the Europeans, with the Arab world, and bring all the finances, all the knowledge that is necessary to Africa. The needs are huge. There's space for everyone there. They should work together on joint projects in Africa, transformational project, and that would be good for everyone, instead of each one having its national flag and then providing very little money. That doesn't change anything.
Ricardo, did you want to add to that?
Well, let me just say there's a big divide between the developing countries on the issue of debt restructuring, because you have sort of like a bifurcation. Either you go through the road of debt forgiveness, or you go through the road of getting access to more lending. But typically what ends up happening is that the moment you say, I'm going to not pay my old debt, markets shut down. And actually, for example, in one of the countries we work on, Ethiopia, they announced that they were interested in this G20 promoted debt restructuring, and they were immediately downgraded by capital markets. Now, many Latin American countries would like to distance themselves as much as possible from any discussion on debt restructuring, because they want to tell markets that they're good for the money and they want more. They want to borrow more. So there's this tension there. The other thing is that on the issue of debt restructuring of the old debt, that's one of the areas where the problem of the US-China problem is most visible, because China has been arguing that China is, for example, for Africa, is the biggest lender, biggest individual lender. And they want to argue that their debt is not bilateral debt, it's commercial debt, and that it shouldn't be restructured under the G20 agreement. And then that has been the issue that has limited progress. But even for the Chinese, it's very hard to say at the same time, forgive the old debt, give me more money. So I think that the solution is really, and the most important thing in the short run, even for Africa, I would say, is to get African countries more concessional resources, because that doesn't add to their future debt burden, and it would give them more flexibility today. So those are my 2 cents.
Can I just add a quick comment? So I totally agree with what Celestin and Ricardo said. I think sometimes people, countries behave as if this is a zero-sum game, zero-sum competition, but it's really, this is a global problem and it needs a global solution. And I very much, I'm not a macroeconomist, but I'm very much, share Celestin's thoughts on the tripartite approach. I think there's thinking about, China and any country's investment in developing world. One thing I think initially, I think this initial debate about China's investment in Africa is partly due to the lack of transparency in the initial, the Belt and Road projects. But that's hopefully is changing. They're trying to make information more public these days. But in terms of the type of projects that China wants to invest in, or international organization wants to invest in, I think there we also need more creative solutions beyond road transportation networks. Now I think within the domestic economy, within China itself, there's a huge emphasis on digital infrastructure. So new sort of internet infrastructure. I think they may be bringing that to the developing world in the next stage, and that's something that can bring promises as we enter into the post-pandemic world.
Thank you. Next question is from Timur.
Hi, yes. So I guess ties in a bit to the question on financing, but I was curious about what people thought about the nature of the long-term demand, given that the whole world has faced like a synchronized shock, and you see countries like the United States sort of flowing money back into the hands of consumers to sort of stimulate demand, and it's not like a debt-driven thing, but they're actually just giving money out. And then I think most of the developing world is probably, gearing their money towards on the supply side, right, to support businesses who will export things and try to get in on the other side of that sort of boom in demand. But is there generally going to be more concentration of demand in the rich world and more supply from the developing world? And is that sort of demand and balancing of the global economy like sustainable for growth in the coming years?
But I can take that. I can start if you want, Sarah.
Yep. Yes, sure.
Well, yeah, thank you. I think it's a very important question because even before the pandemic, in my view, the single most important macroeconomic issue that the world had been facing was the insufficient aggregate demand, global demand. To me, that was the biggest issue. And after the pandemic, that will remain the biggest issue, the level of aggregate demand. Now, if some creatures on a different planet, like let's say March, if they were looking at us here on Earth, they would be stunned in terms of the macro, because they would say, well, there is this part of that planet that has excess savings, a lot of savings. So much savings, they don't even know what to do with it. And I personally believe that the excess savings that we've been witnessing globally is one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why we have low interest rate for so long. So they would see one part of the world having excess savings, and then the other part of the world facing the problem that Temur just raised, which is the impossibility of finding financing for profitable investment opportunities, which are there, that everybody can see. You go to Bangladesh, you go to Douala, Cameroon, you go to Bolivia, you go everywhere, and you can see the infrastructure constraint. And you can see, you don't have to be a genius, a businessman, to realize that there are profitable investment opportunities here. So there are profitable investment opportunities, but at the same time, the excess financing is not making its way to financing because we haven't come up with a framework for, de-risking these investments. Well, I think that's our responsibility as macroeconomists after COVID to come up with a framework for de-risking and facilitating the flow so that Sweden doesn't keep 1 trillion or whatever that is, sovereign wealth fund, sitting there and not knowing what to do with it because they can't find investment opportunities. And you have roads in Kenya that needs to be fixed and which would provide jobs to everyone, including in Sweden. And certainly global peace, because if people work, they are less likely to get into all kinds of things. We know that. So that's the challenge. And I think that's why need for
if people work, it will be.
Sorry, I'm done, Sarah. So I heard someone online. So, but
right, somebody needs to mute. Marcy, G, Ricardo, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I can. So I can add to that from a micro perspective. I think traditionally in the development literature, more like the micro literature, we've been thinking about exactly what, as Tamo mentioned, this sort of supply side interventions and demand side interventions. Now, supply side interventions include giving credits, loans to firms, doing business trainings, all of these things that you want to do to help on the firm. At the same time, there are these, there's a rising, but relatively new, but rising literature about demand side interventions along the lines of creating demand. You know, it could be distributing vouchers, somehow matching the consumers with the firm so that allows the firms to grow. So I think it's still a very new literature, but what we've learned from that big rising literature now is that there are a lot of very important market frictions. Now imagine that imagine there are these pockets of global demand and people really want some goods from some parts of the world and they have the money for it. It's not clear how will they identify the good producers for that good. How do you match the consumer, the right consumer with the right firm? There are a lot of information frictions. Especially when you are thinking about cross-border trade, there are a lot of things that you don't know about these foreign producers. You may not trust the quality levels, and there are like all this kind of disputes with international trade. And so information friction is one thing. The other thing is search friction. How do you find them in the first place? Now, I've talked about the promise for e-commerce, but the fact is that if you go to any e-commerce platform, there are hundreds of pages and no one will browse through all of the pages. And imagine you're in a new promising startup or promising entrepreneur in developing countries. You suddenly open a shop on one of these e-commerce digital platforms, hoping that you will be tapping into the global demand. It's just not going to happen because you will be competing with a lot of this huge superstar incumbent. And so I think the government really needs creative solutions. One thing that we've been trying to discuss with Indonesian government and with ADB is thinking about certifications. There are a way, if government have information about these firms, you can identify who are the promising businesses. Can you somehow provide that information to the market and allow them to match these firms with demand out there in the world? So that's something I think information will be helpful, and third party, it could be the platform, it could be the government or global certifiers can play a role.
Marcy, Ricardo, any additions there?
I'll pass.
Yeah, okay. All right, we don't have any more questions from the audience and we're getting close to our time. So I'm gonna just do we do have one more question. Toko.
Hi, thank you very much to all the panelists. I just wanted to ask a quick question, and I hope it is a quick question, just thinking about the post-recovery in developing countries. I think there's been concerns that there's not enough spending, or at least there won't be enough commitments to a green recovery. I was wondering if you could give us a sense of what might be some of the core policy areas that developing countries could focus on to ensure that they recover better in a green way and continue to be resilient in that way. And I elect Professor Hausmann for that.
Okay.
Thank you. So, a great question. The first thing I would say is that by the standards of the US, Canada, Singapore, which are countries that have spent enormous amount of money in the pandemic, the increase in public spending in developing countries has been pitiful as a share of their much, much smaller GDP. So in general, the fiscal accounts of developing countries have enormously deteriorated, but mostly because of a collapse in tax revenues, not because of an increase in government spending. So people, the developing countries have been managing the pandemic with many, many fewer of the resources that say were included in the last in the $2 trillion package that was just passed. So support for people, support for firms, etc., support for healthcare systems, all of these things that added up to tons of money. Countries are managing without recourse to those things. Going forward in a green recovery, the first thing that countries are likely to be facing is how they can bring their deficits down, not up, right? So they're going to be managing things under very tight conditions. Now, if you want that recovery to be green, I think the most successful elements that we have to date well, let me preface by saying we're not going to stop global warming in Africa, right? So, you know, we should have global warming needs to be stopped in the places where emissions are important, and that's not in Africa, right? So on per capita terms, that's not so much an issue. But there are some technologies that are competitive today with dirty alternatives that would become, that should expand much faster than they're expanding. Let me give you two examples, solar and wind. Because countries have been willing to support their exporters of these equipments with loans, today you have that electricity generated by solar and wind in many countries is cheaper than the fuel cost of generating thermal energy. Forget about the rest of the cost. So those things, they should expand dramatically vis-a-vis current trends, and it would make the world a better place. Obviously, it will require, you know, the issue of managing unreliable and unstable sources of energy, which is a challenge and creates cost to the rest of the system. But that's something that will be there. But that we need to think about, and we need some technological breakthroughs to make it better. By the way, one of the interesting things that I think is going to be part of the recovery is the hydrogen economy. You know, one way to store solar energy is by producing hydrogen. And hydrogen has a bunch of uses. Apparently, the biggest use right now is to generate fertilizers. And those would be green fertilizers, because right now fertilizers are very, very dirty. So that may be, you know, one of the things going forward. There's a big project on that in Namibia. There's a big project on that in Western Australia. That I think more of that could happen. Let me stop there.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to, everybody can unmute for a second and clap in real life for our terrific panelists, Professor Alsan, Professor Bai, Professor Hausmann, Professor Monga. And thank you so much for both leaving us with some pockets of hope and the strong message about how interrelated the wealthier nations and developing nations are as we all move towards recovery.